The first time I heard my own voice coming from his room, I didn't react right away. Not because it didn't scare me, but because my brain refused to accept what I was hearing. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't similar. It wasn't one of those weird moments where you think something sounds familiar and then brush it off. It was exact. My tone, my pacing, the slight pause I take before finishing a sentence when I'm unsure. Even the quiet half-laugh I make when I'm pretending something doesn't bother me. And the worst part? He was saying something I had never said before. I was walking past his door on my way to the kitchen when I heard it. Yeah, I usually go around 8:30, not earlier, it just messes up my whole routine. I stopped instantly, because that wasn't just random conversation. That was my schedule. Something I had casually mentioned maybe 2 weeks ago while making coffee, not even thinking about it. Except I hadn't said it like that. Not word for word, not with that exact rhythm. My body stayed still, but my mind started racing. I slowly turned my head toward his door. It was slightly open, just enough for light to spill into the hallway. I held my breath without realizing it. Then it came again. 8:30 works better for me. Yeah, I prefer 8:30. Softer this time, more controlled, like he was repeating it, practicing it. A cold feeling settled into my chest. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't mimicry for fun. This sounded like rehearsal, careful, intentional, structured. I should have walked away right then, closed my door, locked it, and told myself I misheard something. But I didn't, because something in me needed to know. I took a small step closer to the door, my heartbeat picking up. Another sentence came through. I'll be home around 6, maybe a little later if traffic's bad. That one hit harder, because I knew exactly when I had said it. On the phone, a few days ago, talking to my manager. I had been alone in my room, or at least, I thought I was. My chest tightened. I leaned slightly toward the crack in the door and looked inside. He was sitting at his desk. Straight posture, calm, focused, a notebook open in front of him, and he was reading from it, line by line, speaking out loud. In my voice, not close to mine, not inspired by mine. I felt something shift inside me right then, because there's a difference between something being strange and something being wrong. This was wrong, deeply wrong. He paused, glanced down at the notebook again, then repeated the same sentence, but slightly adjusted like he was refining it. I'll be back closer to 6. Depends on traffic. My stomach turned. These weren't random phrases. They were things I had said. Moments I didn't even remember clearly. Small, forgettable pieces of my day that somehow he had collected, written down, and was now practicing. I stepped back quietly, my heart racing now in a way I couldn't control, because this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was something deliberate. And the worst part, I had invited him into my home. His name was Daniel. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Quiet, polite, almost too easy to overlook. I had rented out the spare room because living alone wasn't making sense anymore financially. The listing went up, he responded quickly, and everything about him seemed normal. We met once before he moved in. Coffee shop, public place, safe. He didn't overshare, didn't ask anything strange. Just enough conversation to seem genuine, but not enough to feel invasive. At the time, that felt like a good thing. I didn't want someone loud or complicated. I just wanted someone who paid rent and stayed out of my way. And that's exactly what he did. For the first couple of weeks, it felt like I lived alone again. He worked nights, so our schedules barely overlapped. We'd pass each other in the kitchen occasionally, exchange a few words. Nothing memorable. If anything, he blended into the background of my life so well, I stopped noticing him, which, looking back, was probably the point, because things had been off before that night. I just didn't recognize it at the time. Small things. A cup I left on the counter would be in a slightly different spot the next morning. My bedroom door would be open a little wider than I remembered. The bathroom light would be on when I was sure I turned it off. Nothing big enough to prove anything. Nothing big enough to confront someone about. Just small inconsistencies. Easy to ignore. Easy to blame on being distracted, or tired, or careless. So I ignored them, because that's what people do. We explain things away until we can't anymore. And that night, I couldn't anymore. I went back into my room and closed the door quietly, locking it without even thinking. My hands felt cold. Not shaky yet, just cold. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at nothing for a few seconds, trying to force logic into a situation that didn't have any. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. Maybe he was recording conversations somehow. But how? I didn't talk much at home. And even if he did, why repeat them like that? Why write them down? Why practice them like scripts? It didn't make sense. None of it did. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my messages, emails, call logs. Anything that could give me some kind of anchor back to reality. Everything looked normal, because on the surface, everything was normal. That was the problem. Nothing about him had been obviously wrong, which meant whatever this was, it had been happening quietly, without me noticing. For weeks, that realization sat heavy in my chest. Because if I hadn't walked past his door at that exact moment, I never would have known. And then something clicked. A memory. Small. Forgettable. But now it felt different. A few days ago at work, one of my coworkers had said something weird. "You sound different today." I remember laughing it off. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, just your tone. It's like softer or something." I shrugged it off, blamed it on being tired, didn't think about it again. But now, it didn't feel harmless. Because what if that wasn't me? What if someone else had been speaking as me? My stomach dropped, because suddenly, a thought formed that I couldn't ignore. What if he wasn't just copying me inside the apartment? What if he was preparing to be me somewhere else? I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. Every sound in the apartment felt louder than usual. Every shift, every creak, every movement made my body tense. I kept my door locked, checked it multiple times, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. My voice, coming from his room, repeating things I didn't remember saying, practicing things I hadn't lived yet. By morning, I had already made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him, not yet, because whatever this was, I needed to understand it first. I needed proof, real proof, not something I could doubt later, not something that sounded insane when I said it out loud. Something solid, something undeniable. I grabbed my phone and stepped out into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet. His door was closed now. No light, no sound, like nothing had happened, like the night before didn't exist. But I knew it did. I walked closer to his door slowly, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of paper taped at eye level, barely noticeable, but intentional. My breath slowed as I stepped closer. It wasn't random. It wasn't a note. It was organized, structured, a list, a schedule, written neatly, carefully, and at the very top, in clear handwriting, was my name. Under it was my entire routine, every detail, every time, every movement, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep, and next to each one was a small checkbox. Some of them were already marked. I didn't touch the paper right away. I just stood there staring at it, trying to convince myself I was misreading something, that there was some harmless explanation I hadn't considered yet. But the longer I looked, the worse it got. My name was written at the top in clean, careful handwriting, and underneath it was my entire daily routine mapped out in detail that went far beyond casual observation. Wake-up time, shower duration, what I usually ate for breakfast, the exact window when I checked my phone before leaving. Even small habits I didn't consciously think about, like how long I stood at the sink or how often I rechecked my bag before walking out the door. Some of the entries had check marks next to them. Not all, just some. And they weren't random either. The earlier parts of the day were mostly checked off, but later ones weren't. It looked like a progress tracker, not just notes. Like someone wasn't just observing me. They were following along, step by step, making sure everything matched. A tight feeling settled in my chest as I leaned in slightly, scanning the details more carefully. Next to a few of the unchecked items were small corrections written in a different pen. Slight changes, adjustments, leaves earlier on Thursdays, sometimes skips lunch, phone call variation. These weren't guesses. They were updates, revisions, like someone was refining a script. I stepped back slowly, my heartbeat picking up again. The hallway suddenly felt narrower than before, like the walls had moved in while I wasn't paying attention. Everything about this felt controlled in a way that didn't make sense. This wasn't random behavior. This was structured, intentional, almost clinical. And the fact that it had been happening long enough to require corrections made it worse. Before I could think too much about what to do next, I heard movement inside his room. It was subtle but unmistakable. A shift of weight, a chair leg scraping lightly against the floor. My body reacted before my brain did. I stepped back quietly, forcing myself to stay calm, even though my pulse was rising fast. The last thing I wanted was for him to open the door and find me standing there staring at that list. I turned and walked back toward my room, keeping my pace steady, controlled, not rushed, not suspicious, just normal. At least that's what I tried to tell myself. Once inside, I closed the door and locked it immediately, my hands moving faster now. The second the lock clicked, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. My mind was racing, trying to piece everything together in a way that made sense, but nothing fit. Every explanation I came up with fell apart the second I looked at it too closely. This wasn't someone casually mimicking behavior. This was someone studying it, tracking it, perfecting it. I grabbed my phone and sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at the screen without really seeing it. Calling someone crossed my mind, but I stopped myself almost immediately. What would I even say? My roommate is writing down my routine and practicing my voice? It sounded insane even in my own head. So instead, I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I opened the voice recorder app. If he was doing this again, I needed proof. Real proof. Not just something I heard once and questioned later. I placed the phone near the door and sat back, waiting. Minutes passed, then more. The apartment stayed quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels deliberate, like something is holding still just long enough for you to relax. I didn't relax. I waited, and eventually, I heard it. Soft at first, faint, but there. His voice. No, my voice. Coming through the wall again. I reached for the phone slowly and started recording, keeping my movements as quiet as possible. Yeah, I can reschedule that. It's not a big deal. My throat tightened. I hadn't said that before. At least, I didn't remember saying it. No, I don't mind. Just send me the details again. That one hit harder, because I had received an email earlier that week about rescheduling a meeting. I hadn't responded to it yet, which meant one of two things. Either he was guessing, or he was predicting. The thought made my stomach twist, because if he wasn't just copying what I had already done, then what exactly was he preparing for? I stayed still, letting the recording run, listening carefully as he continued. There were pauses between sentences, like he was checking something, then repeating the line again slightly differently. Adjusting tone, adjusting pacing. It wasn't random repetition. It was refinement. After a few minutes, the voice stopped. Silence returned, but it didn't feel empty. Felt finished, like he had completed something. I stopped the recording and saved it immediately, my fingers moving faster now. This was real. This was something I could go back to, something I could prove to myself later if my mind tried to convince me none of this happened. But even with that, something felt off. Because the sentences he was practicing, they weren't all from the past. Some of them felt like the future. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand, replaying that thought over and over. Then something else clicked. Something small, but sharp. I opened my email, scrolled through my inbox, and found the message about the meeting, unread. I opened it slowly, read through it carefully, and my chest tightened again, because the wording was almost identical to what I had just heard through the wall. Not exactly the same, but close enough that it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like preparation, like he wasn't just copying me anymore. He was getting ahead of me. I closed the email and leaned back slightly, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't just about identity anymore. This was something else, something more controlled, more precise. And then my phone vibrated. I looked down immediately. It was a new email from my manager. Subject line, reschedule confirmed. My stomach dropped because I hadn't replied yet. Slowly, I opened it. Thanks for confirming. We'll move it to the new time. My fingers went cold because I never sent that email. I checked my sent folder, and there it was, a reply from me, written in my style, my tone, my phrasing, exactly like I would have written it, except I didn't. A heavy silence filled the room as I stared at the screen, my mind trying to process something it couldn't fully understand, because this wasn't just mimicry anymore. This wasn't just observation. Somehow, he was acting as me, outside of the apartment, without me knowing, and that meant one thing I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't going to stay contained. It already wasn't. I slowly lifted my head and looked toward the door again. And for the first time since this started, I realized something that made everything worse. I wasn't just being watched. I was being replaced, piece by piece, and I had no idea how far it had already gone. I didn't go to work that day, not because I was scared to leave, but because I needed to know how far this had already gone. The email sitting in my sent folder kept replaying in my head. It wasn't just similar to how I write. It was how I write. Same phrasing, same tone, even the same way I structure sentences when I'm trying to sound polite but slightly detached. That wasn't imitation anymore. That was access. I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at my laptop screen, trying to retrace every possible way someone could do that. Maybe I left my laptop unlocked. Maybe I stayed logged in somewhere. Maybe he had seen my password. Each explanation felt possible for a second, and then immediately fell apart. Even if he had access to my email, that didn't explain the voice. It didn't explain the schedule on his door. It didn't explain how he seemed to know things I hadn't even said yet. The apartment was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels staged, like someone is deliberately not making noise. I hadn't heard him move since earlier, and that somehow made it worse. It felt like he knew I had seen something, like he was adjusting, just like the notes on that list. I stood up slowly and walked to my door, resting my hand against it for a second before opening it just a little. The hallway looked normal. His door was still closed. The paper I saw earlier was still there, barely visible from this angle. Everything looked exactly the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. I stepped out, moving carefully, not trying to hide but not making unnecessary noise either. The closer I got to his door, the more aware I became of how exposed I felt, like stepping into a space where I wasn't supposed to be. The paper was still taped there. I looked at it again, more carefully this time. The check marks hadn't changed, but something new had been added near the bottom. A fresh line, different ink, cleaner, darker. Email response, completed. My chest tightened instantly. That was recent. That was what I had just seen, which meant he updated this after sending it, after acting as me. A slow, creeping realization started forming in my mind. This wasn't just tracking my routine anymore. This was execution, a checklist, a system where observation turned into replication, and replication turned into action. I took a step back, my breathing slower now, more controlled. Fear was still there, but something else had taken its place alongside it. Focus, because if I kept reacting, I was going to lose control of this completely. I turned and went back into my room, closing the door again, but this time I didn't lock it immediately. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop again, pulling up everything I could think of. Email, social accounts, cloud storage. anything that could show signs of access. At first glance, everything looked normal. No unfamiliar logins, no alerts, no warnings. But the more I checked, the more subtle inconsistencies I started noticing. Tiny things. A document I didn't remember opening had a recent timestamp. A note file I barely used had new edits, small phrasing changes that matched how I usually write, but I hadn't written them. It wasn't obvious enough to trigger alarms, but it was there, and it was consistent, like someone wasn't breaking in. They were already inside. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, letting that sink in. Because if he had access to my digital life and he was practicing my voice and he had mapped out my routine, then this wasn't just about copying me. This was about becoming me, fully. And suddenly, the thought didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt active, in progress. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I picked it up immediately, expecting another email or notification. It was a text from my friend Lisa. "Hey, are you okay? You sounded weird on the call earlier." My chest tightened again. I hadn't called her. Not today. Not yesterday either. I opened the message and stared at it, my fingers hovering over the screen. "What call?" I typed back. Her response came quickly. "Like an hour ago? You called me, but you were acting kinda off. I thought you were just tired." My grip on the phone tightened, because I had been here, in this room, the entire time. I typed slowly. "That wasn't me." There was a pause before she replied. "Okay, not funny. You literally called me." I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, staring at the conversation, feeling something cold settle deeper inside my chest. Because now it wasn't just email. It wasn't just notes. It wasn't just practice. He was interacting with people, as me, and they couldn't tell the difference. I stood up again, my movements slower now, more deliberate. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of the apartment and not come back. But something held me there. Not curiosity anymore. Not confusion. Control. Because if I left now without understanding this, I wouldn't have anything left to come back to. I stepped out into the hallway again, this time not stopping at his door. I walked straight to the kitchen, scanning the space like I was seeing it for the first time. Everything looked the same. Clean. Organized. Nothing out of place. Except for one thing. A mug on the counter. My mug. The one I used every morning. Except I hadn't used it today. I walked over slowly and picked it up. It was still slightly warm. My chest tightened. Someone had used it recently. I set it down carefully and looked around again, my attention sharper now. That's when I noticed something else. A chair slightly pulled out from the table. Not enough to stand out immediately, but enough to feel wrong once you noticed it. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard it. Behind me, a quiet shift. I turned instantly. He was standing in the hallway, watching me. Daniel. For the first time since he moved in, he wasn't avoiding eye contact. He wasn't quiet or distant. He was calm, composed, like nothing about this situation was unusual to him. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. The air felt heavy, like something had already happened and I was just catching up. "You're home early," he said. His voice was normal. His real voice, not mine, not the practiced one, just his. I stared at him, trying to decide how to respond without giving anything away. "So are you," I said. A small pause. Then he nodded slightly like he acknowledged that. "Shift changed," he replied. The words were simple, but something about the way he said them felt placed, like he had chosen them carefully. I didn't respond right away. I just watched him, and for a brief moment, I had the strongest feeling that he was doing the same thing. Studying me, comparing, measuring. Then his gaze shifted slightly, past me, toward the counter. "The mug," he said casually. "I used it. Hope that's okay." My chest tightened again, because that wasn't an apology. It wasn't defensive. It was controlled, like he was acknowledging something small to keep everything else hidden. "Yeah," I said slowly. "That's fine." Another pause. longer this time. Then he smiled slightly. Not wide, not friendly, just enough to feel intentional. "You've been adjusting your schedule," he said. The words hit harder than they should have, because they weren't a question. They were a statement, and they matched the notes on that list. I felt my body go still. "Have I?" I asked. His eyes stayed on mine. "Earlier this morning," he said calmly. "You usually check your phone longer before leaving your room." My throat felt tight, because that was true, but I had never told him that. Not directly, not intentionally, and yet, he knew. I forced a small nod. "Didn't sleep well," I said. Another pause. Then he nodded again. "Right," he said. The way he said it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like confirmation, like he was updating something in his head, adjusting, just like the list. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't just observing me anymore. He was testing me, in real time, seeing how closely I matched the version of me he had built, and whether I was still consistent. The silence stretched for another second. Then he turned slightly, walking back toward his room. "Let me know if anything changes," he said over his shoulder. My chest tightened, because that didn't sound like a normal sentence. It sounded like a request from someone maintaining a system. He stepped into his room and closed the door, and I stood there in the kitchen, completely still, staring at the space he had just been in. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about him becoming me. It was about deciding which version of me stays. I didn't move for a while after he closed his door. The kitchen felt different now, like it wasn't neutral space anymore. Everything in it suddenly carried weight, the mug, the chair, even the way the light hit the counter. It all felt like part of something structured, something that had been quietly arranged without me noticing. The worst part wasn't that he had been watching me. It was that he had been learning me, building something detailed enough that he could compare it in real time. His words kept replaying in my head. "You've been adjusting your schedule." Not a question, not curiosity. It sounded like a system flagging an inconsistency, like I had deviated from a pattern I didn't even know I was being measured against. I walked back to my room slowly, not rushing, not showing anything that could be read as panic. The moment I stepped inside, I closed the door and locked it, then stood there for a few seconds just listening. The apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. This one felt active, like something was still running, still processing, even without sound. I sat down at my desk and forced myself to think clearly. Reacting wasn't going to help anymore. If I kept moving emotionally, I was going to fall behind whatever this was. And I was already behind. I opened my laptop again and went back through everything more carefully this time. Not just looking for obvious signs of access, but patterns. Anything that showed repetition, timing, structure. And once I started looking at it that way, things began to line up in a way that made my chest tighten. Emails sent at very specific times. Not random, consistent. Messages written in my tone, but slightly cleaner, slightly more efficient than how I usually phrase things. Edits to documents that didn't just match my style, they improved it. Subtle improvements, cleaner sentences, more confident wording. He wasn't just copying me. He was optimizing me. That realization sat heavy in my chest, because it meant this wasn't about replacing me with something identical. It was about replacing me with something better, something more consistent, more predictable, more controlled. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a second as that thought settled in. Because if that was true, then every interaction he had as me wasn't just imitation, it was improvement. Which meant over time, people wouldn't just accept it. They would prefer it. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of that thought. I looked down, expecting another message from Lisa or another email I didn't send. Instead, it was a notification from my bank. A transaction alert. I frowned slightly and opened it. It was a small purchase. Nothing unusual on its own. But I hadn't bought anything today. I opened the app and checked the details. It was from a nearby store, one I go to often. The timing was recent, within the last 30 minutes. My chest tightened again, because I had been here, inside the apartment, the entire time, which meant someone else had used my card. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, letting that sink in. It wasn't a huge transaction. It wasn't something that would immediately raise alarms. It was normal, routine, exactly the kind of purchase I would make without thinking, which meant it wasn't meant to be noticed. It was meant to blend in. I stood up again, my movements slower now, more deliberate. Every step felt heavier, like I was moving through something thicker than air. I opened my door carefully and stepped back into the hallway. His door was closed. The paper was still there, but now it felt different. Not like a list anymore, like a progress report. I walked closer again, scanning it carefully. The earlier check marks were still there, but now I noticed something I hadn't before. Some of the entries had small timestamps next to them, precise, down to the minute, and the most recent one matched the time of the transaction on my phone. My pulse spiked, because that meant he wasn't just acting as me digitally. He was acting as me physically, outside, in the real world, without me. A cold realization moved through me slowly. This wasn't just contained to the apartment anymore. It hadn't been for a while. I stepped back again, my breathing steady but shallow. My mind was moving faster now, connecting things I hadn't wanted to connect before. The phone call with Lisa, the email, the bank transaction, all of it pointed to the same thing. He wasn't practicing anymore. He was executing, and he was doing it well enough that no one noticed. That thought should have made me panic, but it didn't, not fully, because alongside the fear, something else was growing. Clarity, because if he was acting as me, then there had to be moments where he wasn't. Moments where the system wasn't perfect, where something slipped. And if I could find those moments, I could understand how this worked. I turned and walked back to my room again, closing the door behind me. This time, I didn't sit down right away. I started writing, not on my laptop, on paper, everything I could remember. Times, events, conversations, small details that felt off but didn't make sense at the time. I wrote it all down, forcing myself to stay focused, to treat it like a problem instead of a situation. And the more I wrote, the more a pattern started to form. There were gaps, specific windows of time where things didn't line up, moments where I couldn't clearly remember what I was doing, but something had still happened. Not large gaps, short ones, 15 minutes, 20, maybe 30 at most. Easy to ignore, easy to forget, but consistent, too consistent to be random. I stared at the list I had made, my grip tightening slightly on the pen, because those gaps, they weren't just empty, they were opportunities. Time where something else could step in, something else could act, something else could be me. A slow, unsettling thought formed in my mind. What if he wasn't just copying me from the outside? What if he had figured out how to insert himself into those gaps? To take over moments I didn't even realize I was losing? My chest tightened as that possibility settled in. Because if that was true, then this wasn't just observation and replication. This was replacement, gradual, precise, invisible. And the more it happened, the less space I would have left. I sat down slowly, staring at the paper in front of me, feeling something shift inside my chest again. Not fear this time, something sharper, because now I understood the system, at least part of it, and understanding something means you can challenge it. But that also meant something else. If he noticed changes in my routine, if he tracked deviations, then anything I did differently from this point forward, he would see, he would adjust, he would respond, which meant I couldn't just react anymore. I had to move ahead of him. For the first time since this started, a clear thought settled in my mind. If he was building a better version of me, then I needed to become unpredictable, something he couldn't track, something he couldn't refine, something he couldn't replace. I picked up my phone again and opened my messages, scrolled to Lisa, and typed slowly, Did anything else feel off during that call? Her response came after a few seconds. Just, you sounded more confident, like you knew exactly what you wanted to say. It was actually kind of nice, just different. I stared at that message longer than I should have, because that confirmed it. People weren't noticing something was wrong. They were noticing something was better. And that made everything more dangerous, because if no one questioned it, then no one would stop it. I locked my phone and set it down, my thoughts settling into something colder now, more focused, because this wasn't just about proving what was happening anymore. This was about stopping it. Before, there was nothing left of me to stop. By the time evening rolled in, I had already decided I wasn't going to follow my routine anymore. Not even a little. If everything he was doing depended on predicting me, tracking me, refining me, then the only way to break that system was to become something he couldn't map. Not just slightly different, completely inconsistent, unreadable. I didn't turn on my usual lights. I didn't sit at my desk. I didn't check my phone the way I normally would. Instead, I moved around the apartment in ways that felt unnatural even to me. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I ever had before, then suddenly went back to my room without doing anything. I opened drawers, closed them, walked halfway down the hallway, then stopped for no reason. It felt ridiculous, but I forced myself to keep going, because every action I took now wasn't about comfort. It was about breaking whatever structure he had built around me. First, nothing happened. The apartment stayed quiet, his door closed, no movement, no sound. For a moment, it almost felt like maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he wasn't watching every second. Maybe this wasn't as controlled as it seemed. Then I heard it, a faint shift from his room. Not loud, not obvious, but enough. And it came right after I did something completely out of pattern, standing in the hallway for no reason at all. I froze, listening. Another sound followed. Paper moving. Something being adjusted. My chest tightened slightly, but this time I didn't step back. I stayed exactly where I was, holding still, waiting. A few seconds later, his door opened. He stepped out calmly, like he had just decided to grab something from the kitchen. His expression was neutral, his movements relaxed, but there was something off in the timing. It wasn't random. It was responsive. He stopped when he saw me standing there. A small pause passed between us. "You're still up," he said. It wasn't a question, just another observation. I shrugged slightly, keeping my expression neutral. Couldn't sleep. His eyes stayed on me for a moment longer than necessary, like he was trying to match something in his head with what he was seeing in front of him. "You usually go to bed earlier," he said. There it was again. Pattern recognition. I let out a small breath, acting casual. "Not tonight." Another pause. Longer this time. Then he nodded slowly, like he was processing something. "Right," he said. But the way he said it didn't sound like agreement. It sounded like recalibration. He walked past me toward the kitchen, his movements controlled, steady. I stayed where I was, watching him carefully now, not trying to hide it anymore. He opened a cabinet, took out a glass, filled it with water, and drank it slowly. Everything about it looked normal, but there was something precise about it, like each action was being executed exactly as expected. Then, without turning around, he spoke again. "You skipped your phone check earlier." My chest tightened. I hadn't noticed that, but he had. I forced a calm tone. "Did I?" He nodded slightly, still facing the sink. "You usually check it within 3 minutes of leaving your room." I didn't respond right away, because that level of detail wasn't observation, it was tracking. He turned then, finally facing me again. "You're changing things," he said. Again, not a question, a statement. I met his gaze, holding it steady. "Maybe I am." Another pause stretched between us, heavier than before. Then something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, just enough, like a system encountering something it couldn't immediately process. "That will make things less efficient," he said. The words landed differently this time, because they weren't about me. They were about his process. I tilted my head slightly. Efficient for who? He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, and for the first time since this started, there was a delay, a real one, not controlled, not intentional, like he didn't have a prepared response. Then he spoke. For the version that works, my chest tightened, because that wasn't me. That was something else entirely. And what happens to the version that doesn't? I asked. His eyes stayed on mine, calm, unmoving. It becomes unnecessary. Silence filled the space between us. Heavy, thick, because that word unnecessary didn't feel like a metaphor. Felt like a conclusion. I nodded slowly like I understood, even though part of me didn't want to. Then I stepped past him, moving toward the living room, deliberately breaking the moment. I didn't want to stand there and let him regain control of the conversation. If this was a system, then it relied on predictability, and I had just disrupted it. Behind me, I could feel his presence still in the kitchen, not moving right away, waiting, observing, adjusting. I sat down on the couch, not turning on the TV, not picking up my phone, just sitting there doing nothing. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, I heard him move again, walking back toward his room. The door closed quietly, and the apartment returned to silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt strained, like something was working harder behind the scenes. I stayed where I was, letting time pass, resisting every instinct to fall back into my usual habits. The longer I stayed unpredictable, the more pressure it put on whatever system he was using. And that's when something changed. My phone buzzed. I looked down. Another notification. Another email. Except this one wasn't from my manager. It was from an account I didn't recognize. No name, just a string of random characters. My chest tightened slightly as I opened it. There was no subject line, no greeting, just one sentence. Consistency is what keeps you real. I stared at the screen, my grip tightening around the phone, because that wasn't random. That was a response to what I was doing, to the changes I was making, which meant this wasn't just him anymore. This was something connected, something larger. I looked toward his door instinctively, my mind racing, because if he was part of a system, then breaking his pattern might not be enough. And then my phone buzzed again. Another email, same sender. This time, a different message. Deviation creates separation. A slow, cold realization started forming. Because those weren't threats. They were warnings. Like I was stepping outside something I wasn't supposed to. And whatever was managing this had noticed. I leaned back slowly, staring at the screen, letting that settle in. Because now this wasn't just about him replacing me. It was about something making sure that replacement stayed consistent, controlled, predictable, and I had just disrupted that, which meant one thing. This wasn't going to stay subtle anymore. I didn't respond to the emails. I didn't delete them either. I just sat there on the couch, phone in my hand, staring at the screen while something inside me settled into a kind of cold clarity I hadn't felt before. Up until now, everything had been about figuring it out, proving it, understanding what was happening. But those messages changed something. They weren't coming from him, not directly. They were too precise, too detached. That meant this wasn't just one person running a strange experiment inside an apartment. This was structured, monitored, and now aware of me. For the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was thinking ahead. Because if consistency is what kept me real, like the message said, then breaking that consistency wasn't just confusing him. It was separating me from whatever system he was part of. And if that system depended on predictability to replace people, then unpredictability wasn't a weakness. It was resistance. I stood up slowly and walked back toward my room, not rushing, not hesitating. Every movement felt deliberate now. I closed the door behind me, but this time I didn't lock it. Instead, I left it slightly open, just enough to change the pattern again. I placed my phone on the desk, screen still on, emails visible, and sat down in the chair without turning on the light. Then I waited, Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have. The apartment stayed silent, but it wasn't empty silence. Felt like something was paying attention, watching for what I would do next, waiting for me to return to a pattern it could recognize. I didn't. I stayed still. Then, eventually, I heard it. His door opened. Soft, controlled. Footsteps followed, slow and measured, moving into the hallway. I didn't turn. I didn't react. I just sat there, letting it happen. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice came calm and even. "You're not following your schedule." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence sit there for a moment before speaking. "Neither are you," I said. Another pause. Then the door pushed open slightly, just enough for him to step inside. I turned my head slowly to look at him. For the first time since he moved in, something about him looked off. Not physically. He still looked like himself. Same posture, same expression. But there was a delay in his movements now. A slight hesitation that hadn't been there before. Like something wasn't aligning properly. "You're creating inconsistencies," he said. The words sounded the same as before, controlled, precise, but the timing was different. Not as smooth. "Good," I replied. That word seemed to catch him off guard. Not dramatically, but enough that it broke the rhythm he had been maintaining. "That will affect the process," he said. I leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my gaze steady. "Then maybe the process is the problem." Silence followed. Heavy, thick, different from before. Because now he wasn't just observing. He was trying to respond. And it wasn't working as cleanly. "That's not how it works," he said after a moment. The sentence sounded rehearsed, but less certain. "Then explain it," I said. Another pause. Longer again. His eyes stayed on mine, but something behind them felt divided. Like part of him was trying to maintain control, while something else was catching up. "The version that is consistent continues," he said slowly. "The version that isn't separates." "There's that word again," I said. "Separates." I stood up then, closing the distance between us just slightly. "What happens after that?" He didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation, that was new, because before he always had an answer. Now he didn't. "Those versions are not sustained," he said finally. My chest tightened slightly, but I didn't step back. "So they disappear," I said. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either, and that was enough. I nodded slowly, letting that settle. Then I spoke again, quieter this time. "And what happens when the consistent version starts breaking too?" That question changed something. I saw it. A small shift in his expression. Not fear, not confusion. Something closer to instability. Because that wasn't part of the system. That wasn't accounted for. "That's not expected," he said. "But it's happening," I replied. Silence again. But this time it wasn't controlled. It was stretched, uncertain. And then something happened I wasn't expecting. His phone buzzed. He looked down at it instantly, like the reaction was automatic. For a split second, I saw the screen. An email. Same format as mine. Same blank sender. Same structure. He froze, just for a moment. Then his eyes lifted back to mine. And for the first time since this started, he didn't look like he had control anymore. "What did you do?" he asked. That question hit differently, because now he was the one reacting. I didn't answer right away. I just watched him. Then I said, "I stopped being predictable." Another silence followed, but this one felt like something collapsing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just breaking structure. His grip on the phone tightened slightly, then loosened, like he didn't know what to do with it anymore. "That wasn't part of the design," he said. "Exactly," I replied. We stood there, facing each other, but the balance had shifted completely. Because now he wasn't ahead of me. He was catching up. And whatever system had been guiding him was now adjusting to both of us. Not just me. The realization hit at the same time for both of us. I could see it in his face, because if I broke the pattern and he couldn't match it, then he wasn't the consistent version anymore either, which meant he wasn't safe either. "You don't understand what happens next," he said. His voice was different now, less controlled, more real. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said, "but neither do you." Another pause. Then his phone buzzed again, and this time neither of us moved right away, because we both knew, whatever that message said, it wasn't just for him, it was for both of us. And slowly, very slowly, he turned the screen toward me. I stepped closer, just enough to read it. One sentence, same as before, cold, simple, final. Multiple inconsistencies detected. My chest tightened, because that wasn't just about me anymore. That was about him too. And that meant one thing. The system wasn't choosing between us anymore. It was removing both. I looked up at him. He looked back at me. And for the first time, we weren't copies. We weren't versions. We were just two people, standing outside something that didn't want us anymore. Neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The structure was gone. The pattern was broken. And whatever came next wasn't controlled anymore. If this made you question what's real and what's not, drop a comment with what you would have done in that situation, and hit subscribe because the next story I'm bringing is even more unsettling than this one.